After almost a year of Glazer dithering, it looks like we might finally have some movement on ownership. This weekend, you probably saw Sheikh Jassim of Qatar pulling out of the running to buy the club. And Sir Jim Ratcliffe of Manchester apparently on the verge of completing a deal, but for only 25%, a minority stake. How does that work? Does this represent a new start? What's it mean for the stadium? This Manchester United news, Sheikh Jassim going out and Sir Jim Ratcliffe coming in, 25% worth. How big is this development?
Well, it's big in that it's just been going on and on for so long. You know, it's almost back to the World Cup when Manchester United announced that there would be a strategic review. There was never a commitment in that statement that the club would be sold. It was, going to explore strategic alternatives, talking about things like the club needing to do significant work on its stadium and infrastructure. And they didn't have money to do that within the club, and clearly, we all know the story of the Glazer ownership is that they were never going to be putting their own money into kind of £1 billion redevelopment of a stadium or building a new stadium or whichever way they went about it. I think the outcome is probably not what people expected throughout the process, and that you've had very, very confident briefings throughout from the Qatari side, from the Sheikh Jassim bid, but also we're not quite sure yet whether those original questions, those questions of investment in the stadium, investment in infrastructure, are necessarily what this deal will mean, because the deal, if it's ratified at a board meeting on Thursday, will be, I think, 25% of the club for Jim Ratcliffe, for Ineos. And in return for that, he appears to be getting control of the club's football operations, which is a very unusual thing for a minority partner of a football club to basically be able to make the decisions about the football side of the business, which arguably defines so much of the rest of the business's ability to succeed. So it's not quite what we expected. I think if you were to tell Manchester United fans 6 months ago this is what it would end up as, there'd probably be some exasperation. If you were to have told them 18 months ago that you would have one of the richest guys in the world in Jim Ratcliffe coming in as part of what is being suggested as a phased takeover, so the starting pistol, I suppose, for moving the Glazers out of the club, then I think there'd have been a lot of optimism. But as ever with the way Manchester United work, kind of the way they've done it and how slow it's been has led it to feel like a more frustrating process.
Essentially what you're saying then is that the Glazers will still own 75% of the club, but Sir Jim Ratcliffe will run it for them.
Kind of. I mean, the Glazers don't own 100% of the club as it is. I think that figure is
96?
More like, I think that's of the voting rights,
Oh,
and then of the shares. There's sort of institutional investors and private shareholders and all that kind of thing, because it's listed on the New York Stock Exchange. So it will bring those percentages closer. But what we don't yet know is how it will all shake out in terms of which kind of shares Jim Ratcliffe will buy, which voting rights they will necessarily have. Hopefully that will come in time in terms of the transparency. It will have to, because United are listed on the stock exchange. But yes, clearly, the majority shareholders, it looks like, will still be the Glazers, and they will be essentially delegating the responsibility of running the football operations at a football club.
Okay. In terms of things that would require a major investment like stadium redevelopment, what does that mean?
Again, I'm very cautious about this whole thing of kind of speaking on behalf of these billionaires that don't do very much talking for themselves, and that there's a lot of kind of briefings and counter briefings, and the reality is, I think, with those kind of issues around pledges of what's going to be invested into stadiums and major infrastructure, I feel like they kind of need to say it themselves, right? I think there was some reporting yesterday suggesting that they would be prioritising investment in the team and staff changes and perhaps the training ground before getting onto Old Trafford. There was some other reporting in the Times today to say that they'd like to try and make Old Trafford into a 90,000 stadium. Now that's clearly work that would be, I think, massively encouraged. Old Trafford is one of the biggest stadiums in the country, but it's not one of the most modern or progressive ones, when you compare it to the ones that have been built over the last 20 years or so. And I think that's, from every kind of experience, it's, I think the people who have been going to Old Trafford for 40 years will say it all looks a bit run down, but also investors that see huge upside in hospitality suites and the money that can be made from those kind of experiences also look at Old Trafford and say that's not good enough. So clearly there is, I don't think it's as simple as sometimes people talk about stadiums only in terms of fan experience or hospitality experience, but I think at Old Trafford it just all needs a bit of updating.
Okay. Adam, I'm sure a lot of United fans would like to have seen an outright transfer of ownership here, and Sir Jim coming in for just 25%. Is that still broadly then, to sum up, good news, or is there the spectre of this just making things more complicated in terms of taking the club in the direction it needs to go?
I think it's definitely complicated. You remember when Arsenal had that situation where you had the Kroenkes and Usmanov for quite a long time, and it can lead to this feeling of conflicting agendas within a club. Also, whose fault is it if something goes wrong? And are you just going to have a situation where one side starts briefing, well, it's all the Glazers, and the other side say, no, he's come in with this idea, they were going to run football operations, now they've messed it up. So I think that's going to be interesting. It's going to be interesting as well because if Jim Ratcliffe is on this journey towards phased control, if you like, of the club, if not a full takeover of 100%, then he will need to sort of start to develop a trust and transparency with the fan base, which means he will, I imagine, be communicating much more than the Glazers have done over the last 15 years. And he will, I think, if you look at what the Chelsea owners have done since they've come in, they've quite often referred to how difficult their inheritance was, right, when trying to explain some of the mistakes perhaps that they've made since then. And Jim Ratcliffe's not going to be able to do that if he's in a business partnership with the Glazers. He can't just come out and say, well, this was wrong, and Joel did this and Avi did that. It would be very, very messy. So I think Manchester United fans are almost going to have to bite their tongues a little bit when Jim Ratcliffe maybe starts doing interviews and says, these are good business partners for me, we're working together, we're trying to achieve stuff together, when probably they just want to hear these guys have been a disaster for 20 years.
Hello there. If you've enjoyed this video, why not subscribe to this channel? The Totally Football Show podcast is available 3 times a week, bringing you all the football news you could reasonably be expected to care about. We've got views, we've got stats, we've got analysis, we've got some of the best football writers around, and the whole thing is absolutely free. So have a listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or all the usual places by clicking on the link below.